cowboys, whiskey, and poker, we all know the movie version of the Wild West Saloon. But here's the real mystery. What was actually on the menu? Were cowboys sinking their teeth into big, juicy steaks? Or choking down beans, bacon, and some dishes you'd never expect? And how on earth did a dusty saloon in the middle of the desert manage to serve oysters shipped straight from the ocean? The role of saloons in the Wild West. When we picture the Wild West, we often imagine dusty streets, horses tied outside, and wooden doors swinging as a cowboy steps into a saloon. But these saloons were much more than just bars where whiskey was poured. They were the very heart of frontier towns. Inside, the air was heavy with cigar smoke and the sharp smell of cheap liquor. A piano might be playing in the corner, struggling to stay in tune, while men gathered around card tables, slamming down their bets in poker or faro. The sound of laughter mixed with angry shouts, as fortunes were won and lost in a single night. For cowboys fresh off the trail, miners covered in dust, or lonely travelers passing through, the saloon was the place to escape the silence of the wilderness. It was where news was shared, friendships were made, and sometimes fights broke out over a spilled drink or a crooked game. But here's the part that many people forget. Saloons also served food, and what you got on your plate depended on where you were. In a small, poor town, you might only find beans, bread, or a thin stew. In a richer mining town or a saloon run by a wealthy owner, you might be surprised to see oysters, fresh meat, or even imported wine on the menu. The food reflected the land and the people. A saloon in Texas might serve chili and tamales influenced by Mexican cooking. In the northern plains, you'd find buffalo meat or venison. Out west near the coast, seafood could appear. Every saloon was different, shaped by what was available, what the owner could afford, and who was sitting at the tables. So saloons were not just drinking houses. They were gathering places, entertainment halls, and restaurants all rolled into one. And the food they served gave a taste of both the hardship and the diversity of the Wild West. The staple foods of saloons. If you walked into almost any Wild West saloon and asked for food, chances are you wouldn't find a fancy menu. Instead, you'd be served simple, filling meals, dishes made to keep a cowboy's stomach full after a long day, not to impress his taste buds. One of the most common meals was beans and bread. Beans were cheap, easy to cook in big pots, and could be stretched to feed a crowd. Many cooks added pork fat or a strip of bacon to give them flavor. The bread was often hard, sometimes stale, but when paired with beans, it became a hearty meal that could keep a man going for hours. Another favorite was stews and chili. These were the perfect everything meals. A saloon cook would throw in whatever meat and vegetables were available, sometimes beef, sometimes rabbit, sometimes even scraps that weren't the best quality. Spices and peppers were added to cover up the taste of tough or old meat. Chili especially became a hit in saloons across Texas and the Southwest, with its fiery, kick-warming cowboys after a long ride. For protein on the go, saloons often had salted and smoked meats. Beef jerky, salted pork, or dried buffalo were tough to chew but lasted a long time without spoiling. Cowboys could carry them on the trail, and saloons kept them handy for quick meals. In many ways, this was the fast food of the Wild West. Breakfast in a saloon often meant eggs and potatoes. Fried eggs with crispy potatoes sizzling in bacon grease were a morning favorite. This simple plate was cheap for the cook and comforting for the customer. Imagine a cowboy sitting at a wooden table, sipping his coffee while filling his plate with eggs and potatoes before heading back out to the dusty trail. And of course, no saloon meal was complete without coffee. But don't imagine the smooth, rich coffee we drink today. Saloon coffee was often bitter, boiled for hours, and sometimes mixed with anything the cook had, like burnt beans or even crushed eggshells, to make it drinkable. Still, for a tired cowboy, it was the fuel he needed to stay awake through a long night of cards or another day of riding. These foods weren't glamorous, but they were the backbone of saloon kitchens. They told a story of survival, meals built on what was cheap, what lasted, and what could fill an empty belly. Luxury and regional foods. Now, while most saloons served plain and simple food, there were some surprises on the menu, especially in richer towns or places close to trade routes. Believe it or not, you could even find luxury foods in the Wild West. Take oysters, for example. Imagine sitting in a dusty mining town in Colorado or Nevada, hundreds of miles from the ocean, and the bartender sets down a plate of fresh oysters in front of you. How was that even possible? They were packed in barrels of ice and shipped by wagon or rail all the way from the coast. It was expensive, it was rare, and it was a clear sign of wealth. If a saloon had oysters, it wanted everyone to know that this wasn't just an ordinary place. It was a place for winners, gamblers, and men who struck gold. But oysters weren't the only unique food. Depending on where you were, you might be served wild game. Out on the plains, buffalo meat was common. In forested areas, there was venison, rabbit, or even prairie chicken on the menu. These meats brought variety, and more importantly, they were fresh, hunted right out of the land around the saloon. In the Southwest, you'd see strong Mexican influences on the table. Tamales, chili con carne, strange steak, chili camain chuane, and tortillas became popular dishes, blending cultures together. Cowboys loved chili not just because it was filling, but because it packed a punch of spice, something missing in the more basic meals of beans and bread. And if you happened to be in a coastal saloon, especially in San Francisco, you'd find food that no cowboy from Kansas would believe. Fresh fish, clam chowder, and seafood dishes were served alongside beer and whiskey. These coastal saloons had access to the ocean, and their menus looked far more like city restaurants than rough frontier bars. So while one cowboy might be eating beans in a small desert town, another might be slurping oysters or enjoying clam chowder by the coast. The food told you where you were, how wealthy the town was, and what kind of people gathered in that saloon. The drinks and side snacks. No saloon in the Wild West was complete without drinks. In fact, for many customers, the main reason to visit a saloon was to get a strong drink after a long, tiring day on the trail, in the mines, or working on a ranch. The number one drink was whiskey, but don't imagine the smooth, aged whiskey we have today. Most Wild West whiskey was rough, harsh, and honestly, not very safe. To stretch their supply and make more money, some saloon owners even watered it down, or added awful things like tobacco juice, kerosene, or burnt sugar to change the taste. It wasn't about quality, it was about getting a quick buzz for a few coins. Then there was beer, which was also very popular, but not always very good. In the early days, beer was often warm and spoiled because there was no way to keep it cold. That changed later when railroads brought ice to saloons, making it possible to chill the beer and keep it fresh longer. That's when beer started becoming a favorite for many saloon visitors. Now let's talk about bar snacks. Just like today's bars offer peanuts or chips, saloons back then also served little snacks, often for free, to keep customers drinking. You might find a jar of pickled eggs sitting on the counter. They were sour, salty, and had a strong taste that made people thirsty again. There were also salted peanuts, pretzels, and crackers, simple snacks that kept your mouth busy while you played cards or chatted with friends. These snacks had a secret purpose. They made you drink more. The saltiness made you want another sip of whiskey or another mug of beer. It was a clever trick by saloon owners to keep customers spending their money all night long. So while the drinks weren't always the best, they were a big part of saloon life. A cowboy might complain about the taste, but after a hard day, sitting with a drink in one hand and a salty snack in the other felt like a little piece of comfort in a wild, unpredictable world. the not-so-appetizing truth. Now, before we imagine saloons as cozy places full of warm food and lively music, we have to face the truth. The food wasn't always good. In fact, in many saloons, it could be downright disgusting. Hygiene in the Wild West was poor. Meat often sat out for too long and spoiled in the heat. Sometimes the stew or chili you ordered might have been sitting on the stove for days, with the cook just adding new ingredients to the old pot. Bread could be stale, coffee could be burnt, and fresh vegetables were a rare luxury. Then there were the rats and flies. Kitchens were often small, dirty, and crowded, with little effort to keep them clean. A cowboy sitting down to eat might notice flies buzzing around his plate, or even a rat running across the floorboards. But after a week of eating nothing but trail rations, even that meal was worth it. That's the thing, cowboys didn't have many choices. Out on the frontier, food was about survival, not taste. A bad stew was still better than an empty stomach. So, they ate what was served, no matter how questionable it looked or smelled. It's funny because when we watch movies, saloons look glamorous. Bright lights, friendly bartenders, and delicious meals. But the real saloons were rough, dirty, and often disappointing when it came to food. The romantic image of the Wild West hides the gritty reality. If you were hungry enough, you didn't care if the stew was old or the bread was hard. You just ate and went on with your day. Cultural and social impact of food in saloons. Food in saloons wasn't only about filling an empty stomach. It was also about bringing people together. Many saloons doubled as boarding houses, which meant they served meals to travelers, ranchers, miners, and anyone passing through town. Sitting down at a long wooden table with strangers wasn't just about eating. It was about sharing stories, making deals, or even finding out the latest news. In towns where life was tough and lonely, a meal at the saloon gave people a sense of community. The food also told the story of the people who lived there. The Wild West was a true melting pot of cultures, and that showed up on the menu. A German immigrant might introduce sausages and sauerkraut. From Mexican cooks came chili and tamales. Irish settlers brought hearty stews. These dishes blended together, creating a mix of flavors that reflected the diversity of the frontier. So, when someone sat down to eat in a saloon, it wasn't just survival food. It was a small taste of the many cultures that had come together in the Wild West. In its own way, food became part of the history, shaping how people connected and lived side by side. From beans and bacon to oysters and tamales, the food served in Wild West saloons wasn't just about keeping people fed. It told the story of the frontier itself, a story of hardship where meals were often plain and survival came first. A story of opportunity, where wealthy mining towns showed off with oysters and fine dishes, and a story of diversity, where immigrants from all over the world brought their own flavors and traditions to the table. So next time you picture a cowboy leaning on the bar, don't just imagine him with a glass of whiskey. Imagine him sitting down with a bowl of chili, a plate of tamales, or even slurping oysters in the middle of a dusty mining town. The Wild West menu might surprise you. Now here's a question for you. Would you eat saloon food if you lived in the Wild West? Would you take your chances with the old stew, or go for the luxury oysters if you could afford them? Let us know in the comments. I'd love to hear your answer.